Right, good morning Year 10. So we're not starting the year as we thought we would, however we need to try and make the best of a bad situation. So we are beginning the new year with the Vietnam War. So this is our final Cold War confrontation, so a clash between communism and capitalism, between the USSR and China, and the United States and the West. So, in order to understand the context behind the Vietnam War and why it occurs, you need to understand what had happened to Vietnam in the previous 20 years and in the previous 50 years. So it all begins in the Age of Empire in the 19th century, when countries from Europe went around the rest of the world, in particular to Asia, and decided to conquer them. And Vietnam was no exception. And Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, was conquered by the French and was known as French Indochina. Now, the French ruled Vietnam, and they ruled over it for many, many decades, and they put across certain cultural changes on Vietnam that were unfamiliar, particularly in things like cuisine, for example. So in Vietnam is one of the few places where you get baguettes outside of France, and they also built a load of French-style buildings, so they left their mark on the country. One of the other things they did was they brought in Catholicism. And what this meant was that the Vietnamese who collaborated with the French in ruling Vietnam tended to adopt Western Christianity as their religion, whereas the native population of Vietnam tended to still adhere to Buddhism. And this creates a tension later on once the Vietnam War actually begins. Now, during the Second World War, the French were invaded by the Germans, so by 1940 they're basically out of the war. And what this meant was that they were forced to abandon their colonies in Asia, and very, very early on in the Second World War, the French left Vietnam to its own devices. What then happened was that the Japanese invaded the rest of the country and took it over and ruled it very, very brutally. Not too different from how the Germans had behaved in Eastern Europe. They killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, and the Japanese were particularly brutal towards them. However, there was one Vietnamese leader who decided to take the fight to the Japanese, and this is this man right here. This is called Ho Chi Minh. Now, first of all, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. He wanted to get rid of the Japanese, and he also wanted to get rid of the French. But what marked him out as being different was that he was also a communist. He wanted to take the poor peasants of Vietnam, who had been persecuted, who had not been allowed to attain much wealth, and bring them up and rise them through. And these ideas became very, very popular. So throughout the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh led a guerrilla army, known as the Viet Minh, against the Japanese, and they proved to be very, very successful. The Japanese are never able to completely defeat the Viet Minh, and the Viet Minh operate these guerrilla tactics, whereby, considering they were a far weaker force than the Japanese, who were a highly professional army, the Viet Minh would sort of lure the Japanese into the jungle and attack them and then disappear again. They adopted these hit and run tactics because that would be the most effective thing for them. And throughout the war, the Viet Minh are very, very successful. They continue harassing the Japanese right up until the end of the Second World War, when the Japanese pull out, and the Vietnamese are left by themselves for a very, very small period of time. However, once the Second World War ends, the French decide that they need to reclaim all of their lost territories. So they immediately go back into places like Vietnam, or French Indochina as they named it, to try to reassert their authority and dominance over the rest of the country. As it would be expected, Ho Chi Minh and a lot of the other Vietnamese did not take too kindly to this. They had not spent years fighting the Japanese to have their hard-won freedom taken away from them by the French, who had abandoned them as soon as the war broke out. So over the coming years, the Viet Minh waged another guerrilla war against the French colonial forces, using the same tactics they had used against the Japanese, and once again proved to be very, very successful. This culminated in the most important battle of the French war in Vietnam, was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And if you look on page 80 in your textbook, you can see a map of Vietnam, and Dien Bien Phu is just to the west of Hanoi. Now, what happened at Dien Bien Phu is that you had a French parachute battalion who parachuted into the area and formed a defensive position. The Viet Minh continued to harass them for weeks and months, and eventually the French were forced to surrender. Now this was a gigantic humiliation for the French, who had not only been humiliated in the Second World War by losing to the Germans very, very quickly, but they were now unable to defeat sort of this ragtag bunch of guerrilla soldiers who had surrounded them and defeated them. And this really boots the French out of Vietnam, and they are forced to withdraw. Now this posed a massive, massive problem for the United States, because the Chinese, having gone over to communism under Mao Zedong, began heavily supporting Ho Chi Minh because he was a fellow communist, and they were giving him lots and lots of money, they were giving him lots and lots of support. And this was a big issue. Because not everyone in Vietnam wanted communism. They certainly wanted to get rid of the French, for many of them, but there was a split. You had Ho Chi Minh and his supporters who were communists, who were mainly concentrated in the north, but then in the south you had the southern Vietnamese leader, a man named Diem. Now Diem was a Catholic, which marked him out as being different from the rest of the Vietnamese population. Now, why was this a problem? Diem was incredibly corrupt, he was incredibly brutal, he made sure his friends got the best jobs, and he made sure his family had lots and lots of money off the backs of the ordinary Vietnamese people. Now, here he is meeting the American President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, during Eisenhower's presidency throughout the 1950s, so just before Kennedy comes in 1960, Eisenhower was president from 1952 to 1960. Now, Eisenhower had an idea. And the idea went something like this. It was known as the domino theory. And what it made the point that if Vietnam were to fall and become completely communist, the rest of Southeast Asia would also fall. Because what was happening was the Soviet Union and the Chinese were giving tons and tons of money to communist groups throughout Southeast Asia. And if they were to fall to communism, that entire region of the world would be lost to communism, and it would make the West and the capitalist, freedom-loving societies far weaker. So as we can see from the cartoon, we have our Viet Cong, as they were now known. They've changed from being the Viet Minh to the Viet Cong. And here we have our countries shown as dominoes. If Vietnam were to fall, soon it will be Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India and Bangladesh. And here we have, a soldier in American military uniform holding up. That was Eisenhower's view. If we allow Vietnam to fall, we can get Southeast Asia will crumble. And that'll make the position of capitalism and of Western societies far weaker. So what does Eisenhower begin to do? Initially, he does not offer military support to the South Vietnamese. He merely offers advisors. Now these were American military personnel who went to Vietnam to train their forces on how to fight the insurgencies. But as time goes on, the American impact on Vietnam begins to change. Once Kennedy is in power, there's a reluctance to send soldiers into Vietnam. They are far more willing, they're more than happy to send advisors and they're more than happy to send money, but there is an unwillingness to completely commit. However, the war does not go very, very well for the South Vietnamese, and eventually America is left with no option but to begin to intervene. So as you can look at the graph on the bottom of page 81, you can see the blue line, which demonstrates the American troops that are based within Vietnam. And right up until 1965, there's maybe 25 to 30,000 American servicemen in the country. By the time we get to 1969, there's well over 500,000, and then it begins to decline once again. And as you can also see, the amount of dead, based on the red line, that occurs during this war. This was a very, very costly war for the Americans, both in terms of lives, but also in money. The American tactics proved to be somewhat ineffective, and I'll come on to what the Vietnamese did during the war in the next lesson. But one of the things that you need to be aware of is that when Kennedy dies, he's replaced by a man named Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson inherits this war, but the key thing to remember is when Kennedy is in power, the American sort of footprint on the country is very, very limited. It's a few thousand troops. Once Lyndon Johnson gets into power, he ramps up the American military involvement. He sends hundreds of thousands of American soldiers into Vietnam, and he begins something known as Operation Rolling Thunder. What this meant was that you'd have big American bomber planes flying over Vietnam and flattening the entire country in the hope of forcing the Vietnamese into submission. More American bombs were dropped on Vietnam than were dropped in the entire Second World War. So it was phenomenally costly, and it proved an utter failure. So for today's lesson, what I would like you to do, I would like you to read pages 80 and 81, and then in the purple box on page 81, you have got 4 questions that I need you to answer. Okay? So, thank you very much, Year 10, and we'll see how you get on.